also include entitlement to a benefit under federal or state law. Examples of property interests are extensive, including, for example, the right to a free public education. Even if something is not considered an inherent right, once a person has it, depriving it requires due process. So while the right to a free public education is not considered a fundamental right in most states, once the state does provide it, it must afford people due process before it withdraws that education, such as, for example, by suspending or expelling a student. The procedural requirements for effective due process vary based on what right is being deprived. Some of the procedural rights that apply to various types of right deprivations include an unbiased tribunal, which is applicable to criminal cases and detentions for safety purposes, notice of the proposed actions and the grounds asserted for it, this is applicable to almost every deprivation, opportunity to present reasons why the proposed action should not be taken, this is also applicable to most deprivations, including denials of benefits, the right to present evidence, including the right to call witnesses. This is applicable to criminal trials, denials of access to one's children, and comparable deprivations. The right to know the opposing evidence, this is applicable to criminal prosecutions. The right to cross-examine adverse witnesses, also to criminal trials. The opportunity to be represented by counsel, which is also something that's relevant to criminal prosecutions. And the requirement that the tribunal prepare a record of the evidence presented. This is applicable to criminal prosecutions and many administrative hearings. In other cases, there are lesser standards for due process rights. For example, in the case of a suspension of a child from public school, the child has the right to an opportunity to be heard, but not necessarily the right to a full adversarial hearing. In Matthews v. Eldridge, the Supreme Court established a three-part test to determine the appropriate level of due process for a deprivation. 1. Analyze the private interests affected by the official action. 2. Evaluate the risk of an erroneous deprivation of the private interest through the procedures used and the probable value of additional or substitute procedural safeguards. And 3. Analyze the government's interests in administrative and fiscal efficiency. Let's look at each of these factors. Regarding factor number 1, the greater the value of the deprivation, the greater the due process that must be afforded. For example, the Supreme Court has reasoned that real property ownership holds greater intrinsic value than personal property ownership, and therefore that deprivations of real property trigger greater due process protections.